The night pressed heavily over the village of Blackwood, as if the fog itself carried secrets no one dared whisper aloud. In the autumn of 1835, the old schoolhouse stood at the end of a crooked lane, shrouded in ivy and silence. Its bell tower had long since stopped ringing, yet villagers swore they heard its mournful chimes echo through the mist at midnight, calling to children who never came home. The hook was not a tale to frighten. It was a truth that the villagers bore like a curse. Every family in Blackwood could name a child who had entered the silent school and never returned. Parents whispered their names in candlelit prayers, afraid that the walls themselves might be listening. The first to vanish was little Annie Walsh, daughter of the miller. Her books were found neatly stacked on her desk, her quill still wet with ink. Then came Thomas Harker, his satchel abandoned in the cloakroom, as if he had stepped outside for air and simply never returned. Within 3 months, 10 children had been claimed by the school. The building itself was old, far older than the village. It was said to have been built over the ruins of a monastery that burned in the 1600s. The foundation stones bore strange carvings, serpentine shapes and twisted faces that no scholar could explain. But Blackwood was poor, and the building was all they had, so the children kept attending, until fear turned the classrooms into tombs of silence. By November, parents locked their doors tight at night. Lanterns burned late into the hours when the bell was said to toll. "It's not for us," they muttered. "It calls only to the little ones." And indeed, more than one child had woken in the night, eyes glazed, whispering that they heard the school calling. Some resisted, clutching their blankets with white knuckles. Others slipped out barefoot into the fog, drawn to the invisible thread of that phantom bell. The villagers finally sought answers from the school's last surviving teacher, Mistress Eliza Crane. She was a stern woman with hollow cheeks and piercing eyes who had taught there for 20 years. She insisted the disappearances had nothing to do with her lessons, though she admitted the air within those halls often felt heavy, as though we were breathing the same dust as the dead. Rumors spread that Mistress Crane herself was involved, that she had made a bargain with something buried beneath the school. Some said she was seen wandering the graveyard at night, speaking to shadows that moved against the moonlight. Others swore they saw her carrying offerings into the basement, bread, wine, even small birds with their throats cut. Yet when the parents demanded the school be shut, Mistress Crane refused. "Education is salvation," she hissed, her voice cutting like a knife. "You would condemn your children to ignorance, and that is a far crueler fate than death." But the truth was darker still. The parents who forced their children back into the classroom soon regretted it, for those were the very ones who vanished next. Whole rows of desks emptied by unseen hands. One bitter night, the village blacksmith, James Rowe, decided he would uncover the truth himself. His daughter, Mary, had gone missing, and grief turned to rage in his blood. Armed with an axe, he entered the school after midnight. Witnesses claimed they heard him screaming from within the stone walls, screams that twisted from fury to terror, then to silence. When the men burst in at dawn, they found no trace of him. Only his axe lay on the floor, its blade slick with something dark that was not quite blood. By winter, the school was shuttered. Yet even in its silence, the bell tower tolled. No man dared approach, but every villager knew the curse had not ended. It waited. And on the first snowfall of December 1835, a new sound joined the bell's hollow cry. The faint, ghostly chorus of children's voices singing a hymn no one recognized. The snow thickened over Blackwood as December bled into the new year. Families barred their doors tighter, yet even locked shutters could not keep away the sound of that phantom bell. Each midnight it rang, 3 hollow strikes followed by whispers, the kind that crawled under skin like cold water. The villagers began to whisper too, but in fear, not defiance. They knew their children were not simply vanishing. They were being taken. The question remained, by whom or by what? Suspicion circled back always to Mistress Eliza Crane, the last teacher of the silent school. She had been seen more than once walking to the schoolhouse after dark, her lantern swinging, her figure cutting across the fog like a shadow stretched too thin. Some claimed she spoke to the air, reciting words in a tongue older than English. Others said her lantern never went out, even when the wind howled hard enough to snuff a flame. Thomas Blythe, the village vicar, confronted her one morning outside the church. His voice shook with fury as he demanded she reveal what she knew. Mistress Crane fixed him with her hollow eyes and said only, "If you fear the school, it is because you do not understand what it offers." Ignorance is the true curse here, not knowledge. The vicar spat at her feet, but in his eyes burned something close to terror. It was not until the cooper's wife, Margaret, sneaked into Crane's cottage that the truth began to leak. Margaret claimed she found a book. Black leather, its edges cracked like dried skin, hidden beneath the teacher's floorboards. She swore its pages were filled with names, written in Crane's precise hand. Not just the names of the missing children, but dates. And beside each date, a strange mark, like a circle with 3 slashes through it, the same mark carved faintly into the stones of the school's foundation. Margaret fled with the ledger, but when she tried to show it to the villagers, the book was gone, vanished from her satchel without a trace. She knows, Margaret wept. She knows, I looked. That night, Margaret's youngest son was found standing barefoot in the snow, his eyes glazed white. He did not speak, only hummed the same hymn the children were heard singing with the tolling bell. By morning, he too was gone. Rumors spread that the school had been built over something unholy. The older villagers recalled tales of a monastery that once stood there, its monks accused of heresy. Some said they worshipped knowledge not meant for mankind, that their library contained texts written in blood. When the monastery burned, their screams were said to echo in the hills for weeks, and no one dared rebuild, until centuries later when the school was razed. And yet, Mistress Crane remained. She never left the village, even as families fled one by one. It was as though the school itself held her fast, its grip like chains around her soul. The few who dared ask her why she stayed received the same cold answer: I cannot leave until the debt is paid. Mary Rowe, the blacksmith's wife, had lost both her daughter and her husband to the school. Where others fled, she stayed, her grief sharpening into a blade of rage. She swore before God and man that she would burn the building to the ground, curse or no curse. On the final night of December, Mary carried an oil lamp and a sack of coal into the schoolhouse. She was seen entering through the rotted doors, her face grim with vengeance. Hours later, fire lit the night sky, black smoke pouring from the windows as flames devoured the wood. Villagers gathered at a distance, their faces pale, listening. But instead of screams of burning timber, they heard, horribly, unmistakably, the laughter of children. Dozens of voices giggling, echoing through the flames. Mary Rowe was never seen again, and by dawn, the schoolhouse still stood. Not a single beam had burned, not a single stone blackened. Only Mary's oil lamp remained on the steps, glass cracked, flame long dead. After that night, more than one villager reported seeing children in the graveyard behind the church. Not living ones, ghostly figures, pale and flickering, their eyes hollow, but their mouths smiling, would stand between the tombstones in neat little rows, as though waiting for a lesson to begin. An old shepherd swore he saw his grandson among them, staring at him with eyes that begged for release. When he tried to approach, the boy's lips parted, and he whispered, "The school is never empty." The shepherd collapsed dead in the snow the next morning, his face frozen in a scream. By the end of winter, the village of Blackwood was nearly abandoned. Only a handful of families remained, too poor to leave or too stubborn to yield. Those who stayed knew one thing: Mistress Crane had made a bargain, and the school was its altar. Every toll of the bell was a summons, every missing child, payment. And yet, Curse was not content. Villagers could feel it growing hungrier. One bitter night, as the fog rolled in thick as wool, the bell rang again. Not 3 times, 7. Sound shook the windows, rattled the doors, made the very earth tremble. And when the villagers dared look toward the school, they swore they saw figures, dozens of them, standing in the windows. Small figures, watching, waiting. Silent School was no longer satisfied with children. It was calling for everyone. First week of January 1836 brought no sunlight to Blackwood. The skies remained the color of ash, and the snow fell with a silence pressed heavy on the ears. Few villagers who remained in their cottages lived with shutters drawn, praying to God for the curse to end. Prayer held no sway here. Bell tolled again on the second night of the new year. 7 strikes, just as before. This time the villagers didn't dare gather outside. They remained in their homes, clutching rosaries and whispering psalms. Still, the sound seeped through the cracks of their walls, entering their dreams. And in those dreams the children sang. No one remembered the melody. Those who heard it swore it was not of this earth, not a hymn or a folk tune, but something far older. It was a circular song, looping endlessly without beginning or end. And yet the words were clear. Knowledge is the key. Blood is the ink. We write our names so none may sink. Those who woke from this dream claimed the song clung to their tongues for days. They hummed it without realizing, until someone pointed out the tune, and then their faces would turn pale, as if realizing the song itself feeding on them. Liza Crane became bolder as the curse deepened. No longer content to haunt the schoolhouse, she began visiting homes after dark. Always at the door, never crossing the threshold, lantern in hand. She would knock only once, and when the door opened, she would say, "Your child has been chosen. It is better to surrender than to resist. One father, Miller, named Andrew Pike, slammed the door in her face and cursed her name. The very next night, his youngest son awoke screaming, his hands clawing at his own throat. Before anyone could stop him, the boy tore open his skin with unnatural strength. He died before dawn. In the morning, Pike found his door scratched with the same 3-slashed circle from the ledger, packed his belongings and fled, abandoning even his wife in terror. It was not long before the villagers began seeing the children outside their dreams. One evening, a widow named Clara Dunn heard voices outside her cottage. She peered through the frost-slicked window and saw them, 24 children, standing in a perfect row in the snow, their mouths open in song though no sound reached her ears. Faces were blank, their eyes gleaming with wet light. Among them, she recognized her own daughter, dead for 6 months. Clara screamed and threw open the door, stumbling toward the child. When she reached the edge of the yard, the figures vanished, leaving only footprints in the snow, small, delicate, leading toward the schoolhouse. Clara was never seen again. By now, the remaining men of the village gathered in secret to decide what must be done. There were only 11 of them left, and everyone had lost someone to the curse. "Dig beneath it," said the vicar, Thomas Blythe. "The monastery is buried under that school. Whatever foul covenant they made still festers in the ground. We must dig it out and salt the earth." So they went, armed with shovels and lanterns, beneath a moon that shone cold and brittle, dug behind the schoolhouse where the foundation stones curved into the earth. For hours they labored, until their spades struck something harder than soil. A slab of stone, smooth, unbroken, carved with the circle and slash sigil, larger than any had ever seen. But it was not merely a stone, for as they struck it with pickaxes, the slab gave a low, hollow moan, like a breath escaping a mouth sealed for centuries. Men froze. The sound came again, louder, groan of something alive. Then, faintly, they heard it. Children's voices rising from beneath the slab, singing the endless hymn. Knowledge is the key, blood is the ink. Terrified, they fled, leaving their tools scattered in the snow. By dawn, the tools were gone, buried, swallowed. It was around this time that a new presence was felt in Blackwood. Not Mistress Crane, not the choir, but a woman in white. She was first seen by the graveyard, where the children stood in rows. Unlike them, her face was veiled, her figure drifting like smoke between tombstones. Those who saw her swore she carried a bouquet of wilted flowers, their petals blackened. She would pause at each grave as though searching, then lift her veil just enough to reveal a jawbone bare of flesh. Villagers began calling her the waiting bride. Some whispered she was no ghost at all. The first victim, the one who had been sacrificed, sealed a woman promised marriage, but delivered instead to the grave, her soul chained to the earth in vengeance. They said it was her justice that stirred the curse, not Crane's will alone. Driven by despair, the vicar entered the school himself one Sunday, claimed he would consecrate the ground, drive out the evil with holy water and scripture. He did not return until the next morning, when a group of villagers found him standing at the blackboard of the classroom. Cassock was torn, his hair white, though he had been only 40. His hand bled where nails had been torn from his fingers, and with that blood he had written on the wall, "Children do not forgive." When they tried to lead him away, he bit his own tongue in two and died at their feet. The school was silent again, but the smell of blood clung to its walls for weeks. On the final night of that winter, the bell tolled once more. This time, the entire village gathered outside, their fear too great to keep them indoors. They saw the school's windows flare with light, as though candles had been placed in every room. They saw the shadows of children dancing across the panes, their figures twisting in ways no child's body should bend. And then they heard the song, not in dreams, not in whispers, carried on the wind, rolling over them like a tide. Knowledge is the key, blood is the ink. As the song ended, the bell tower split with a crack that echoed across the valley. The iron bell fell, shattering into the snow. Villagers thought this might be the end. From the broken tower, a figure stepped forward. Mistress Crane, lantern blazing in her hand. Behind her, rows of children, their mouths open, their eyes glowing white. The snowstorm that night raged like a living thing, but the villagers swore they could still see her. Bride, gliding through the graveyard, veil trailing in the wind. Her figure seemed almost human, yet her movements betrayed something else. She did not stumble in the drift, did not leave footprints. The lantern light of Mistress Crane illuminated her for all to see, as though the schoolmistress herself was summoning the bride from the earth. When the villagers saw the two women standing together, cruel teacher and the veiled corpse, they knew this was no longer just a haunting. It was a reckoning. Old Margaret Ewell, the midwife who had lived longer than anyone in Blackwood, whispered then what none had dared speak. The pact was not Crane's alone. The bride was the first blood. Promise broken, the union denied. They killed her to seal the school. Villagers stared. Margaret told them of the story buried in hushed tongues. Decades earlier, before the school was ever built, a woman of Blackwood had been betrothed to a wealthy merchant's son. But on the eve of her wedding, she was taken into the wood, where the clergy and landowners bound her in a secret rite. Her life was traded for knowledge and prosperity. Her death, binding the land with cursed wisdom. Her body was hidden beneath the cemetery. Her spirit never left. Mistress Crane had only reignited what was already sleeping, and now the bride wanted just dozens of them, pale and stiff, their mouths sewn with invisible thread. Their small boots did not crunch the snow. Their eyes glowed with the milky sheen of the dead. They moved in perfect formation, past the cottages, through the village square, straight toward the church. Father Blythe was gone, buried by his own madness, but his chapel stood, a beacon of faith untouched. The villagers rushed to lock the doors, to barricade the altar. The children only stood outside, waiting, humming that eternal hymn. Then Mistress Crane appeared, lantern lifted. She spoke with a voice that carried through the storm, though her lips barely moved. School is not a place, it is a covenant. Walls are your graves, the bell your mourning. Surrender the living, or the dead will not rest. Bride stood at her side, lowering her veil just enough to reveal the cavern of her face, skinless, hollow, her teeth bared in an eternal scream. Not all would bow. A farmer named Elias Granger, whose 2 daughters had been lost in the first vanishings, stepped forward with a musket. His breath froze white in the air as he leveled the weapon at Crane. "Take me if you must," he cried, "but you'll not have another child." He fired. Shot rang across the square, echoing off the frozen houses. Mistress Crane's lantern shattered in her hand. Glass sprang the snow. One moment, her face flickered. Not flesh, not bone, something waxen, melting, like a doll held too close to fire. Then the children screamed. The sound pierced the skulls of every villager, forcing them to their knees. Some clawed at their ears, others vomited blood into the snow. Elias dropped his musket, clutching his head. He screamed louder than them all. His body convulsed, then went still. His mouth frozen open, his eyes rolled back. When the villagers lifted their heads, Elias was gone. Only his boots remained in the snow, smoking as though burned from within. The bride moved forward then, separating herself from Crane. She drifted closer to the church, stopping only when she stood before the villagers, Kay crumbling in her skeletal hands. Her voice was not spoken but heard in every mind at once. Blood was stolen. Blood must be repaid. I waited in the earth. I will wait no longer. And then she turned, slowly, her veil brushing the ground, and pointed to the schoolhouse with her withered bouquet. The children followed her gesture, one by one turning their heads until every milky eye was fixed on that cursed building. It was not the church they sought. It was the place where the pact had been sealed. That night, light bled from the cracks in the school's shutters. Not candlelight, but something sickly, green and wet like swamp fire. The bell tower, though shattered, gave a deep groan, as though preparing to toll once more. The walls moved. The villagers who dared look swore they saw faces in the timbers, children's faces pressed from within, their mouths open in silent screams. The roof seemed to breathe, shingles rising and falling like ribs. Then the door opened. Mistress Crane entered, lantern reformed in her grasp. The children followed, filing inside like soldiers obeying a general. Last of all, the bride drifted through the doorway without touching the ground. When the door shut, the sound echoed through Blackwood like a coffin nailed shut. By dawn, half the village was gone. Not dead, simply vanished. Whole cottages stood empty, fires still burning in their hearth, meals half-eaten on tables. Only silence remained, and in the snow outside, those same tiny footprints leading toward the school. Survivors gathered in horror. Margaret Yule whispered the only words she knew. "We are living inside a grave, and the grave is hungry." Villagers argued. Some demanded flight, others demanded fire and destruction. But no flame caught on the school's wood. No matter how much pitch or oil they threw, the walls refused to burn. And so, in desperation, they turned to the graveyard. The bride was the key, and perhaps she was also the solution. Men and women dug at the edge of the cemetery where the oldest graves lay, lanterns guttering in the cold wind. Hours passed. The earth gave way reluctantly, as though clinging to its secrets. At last, their shovels struck fabric. Tattered wedding gowns still wrapped around bones. Skull wore a rusted crown of flowers, jaw locked in a permanent scream. But the corpse was not still. Its hands twitched, jaw cracked. In the hollow sockets, faint light began to glow. Villagers recoiled, dropping their shovels. They had unearthed not salvation, but the very heart of the curse. Bride rose from the soil, her veil lifted, and for the first time she spoke aloud, her voice a jagged scream that split the night. Justice. School bell, shattered for weeks, rang once more, clear and deafening. And every grave in Blackwood shifted. The dead were waking. The moment the bride tore herself free of the earth, the ground across Blackwood split like parchment. Gravestones tilted and toppled. Hands, skeletal, leathery, soil-soaked, clawed out from below. Dead villagers of centuries past began to rise, their hollow eyes glowing faintly like coals in the snowstorm. Bride stood at their center, veil drifting as though in water, bouquet rotted to black ash in her skeletal hands. Her scream had summoned them, and the whole graveyard bent to her will. And then above it all, the bell tolled again. 1, 2, 3. Each peal rang like a command, binding the horizon to the school's hunger. Dead turned toward it in unison, their cracked jaws moving in silent chant. School was no longer just a building. It was a body. Villagers, desperate and terrified, watched as the school stretched and twisted. Timbers bent like limbs, its windows blinking like eyes. Bell tower elongated, resembling a skull on a crooked neck. With every toll, the building swelled larger, dragging itself across the frozen ground. Roots of wood and bone jutted from its foundation, spreading into the earth like veins. From its door spilled children more than had ever lived in Blackwood, marching in endless streams. Their mouths were sewn shut by threads of shadow. Their eyes wept black tears that froze on their cheek. Bride stepped forward, her veil brushing the snow, and lifted her hand. Children halted. Villagers clutched one another, knowing the moment of judgment had come. But then, Mistress Crane appeared again, live, or something worse. Her body was no longer entirely human. Her skin had hardened into wax, her eyes two melted pits glowing faintly. She fell to her knees before the bride. "I gave them to you," she cried, her voice cracking. "I kept the covenant alive. Spare me. Let me remain your vessel." Bride turned her hollow sockets on her. Dead children tilted their heads in unison. Then, impossibly, the bride smiled. It was not mercy, it was ownership. She reached out with one skeletal hand and placed it on Crane's forehead. Schoolmistress screamed as her flesh cracked apart like porcelain, fragments falling into the snow. From within her body, dozens of tiny hands burst outward, clawing for air. Children she had stolen were tearing themselves free. And the body fell. It was no longer Crane. It was only a hollow shell, packed with writhing bones. Bride had taken back what was hers. Villagers, seeing Crane's fate, panicked. Some fled into the woods, stumbling blindly through the storm. Others collapsed in prayer. Margaret Yule, the old midwife, stood firm. She stepped forward, her frail hands shaking, but her voice steady. "Bride of Blackwood," she called. "Your suffering is just, your vengeance deserved. But if you take us all, the land itself will die. There will be no memory left, no one to speak your name." Bride turned, veil fluttering. For a moment, the storm stilled. Villagers dared to hope. But then, the bride raised her skeletal bouquet, and the storm howled even louder. Her voice filled every mind at once. "If no one lives to tell, the silence will tell for me." Graves burst open in a frenzy. Bodies half-rotted, some missing limbs, some still dressed in the tatters of long-buried wedding gowns, soldier uniforms, or Sunday suits, rose and surged toward the living. Villagers fought, pitchforks, axes, even bare fists against claw and bone. Each strike did nothing. Corpses rose again, stitched back together by invisible threads. Children, spectral and eyeless, swarmed over the cottages, seeping through cracks, pulling families into the snow. Screams echoed, and choked into silence. One by one, houses went dark, fires hissed out. Bride watched, veil glowing faintly with the green fire of the school. Her vengeance was complete. By dawn, Blackwood was silent, except for one. Margaret Yule staggered through the cemetery, blood staining her shawl. She clutched an old book of prayers, though she knew it would not save her. She stumbled before the bride, who loomed like a figure carved of bone and storm. Margaret raised her book. "If you take me," she whispered, "then let me see you. Let me see what you truly are." The bride paused, then slowly she lifted her veil. What Margaret saw was not a skull, not a corpse, it was a mirror. Her own face stared back at her, young and unlined, wearing the crown of wilted flowers. Margaret dropped the book. Tears froze on her cheek. She understood at last that the curse was not just one woman's death. It was all of Blackwood, the whole village bound to the vow of sacrifice. Now, it was eternal. Bride placed her hand on Margaret's chest. The old woman fell without a sound. When travelers passed Blackwood years later, they found only ruins. Cottages collapsed, chapel blackened, fields overgrown. The school still stood, bell tower crooked against the gray sky, windows dark and empty, door ajar, as though waiting. Sometimes, when the wind carried right, a faint sound of children humming drifted from its walls. The villagers were gone. The school had not forgotten. And in the graveyard, the bride's figure lingered, veil fluttering in the endless winter. She was still waiting, not for justice,